I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd end up in a neighborhood with an HOA. Growing up in rural Montana, I valued my independence and the freedom to do what I wanted with my own property. But when I landed that dream job at the aerospace research facility in Meadowvale, the housing options near work were limited. Pinecrest Estates seemed perfect: quiet streets, well-maintained common areas, and conveniently located just 15 minutes from the lab. The first month was bliss. My neighbors were friendly, though a bit reserved. The house itself was everything I'd wanted: a spacious 3-bedroom with a large backyard perfect for my unusual hobby. As a falconer for over 20 years, I'd brought along my 2 Harris's hawks, Artemis and Apollo, and my peregrine falcon, Hermes. I'd set up their mews, a specialized enclosure, discreetly at the far end of my backyard, partially hidden by trees. My peaceful existence shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when a sharp knock interrupted my work-from-home day. Standing on my porch was Victoria Harrington, HOA president, clipboard in hand, and a pinched expression on her face that suggested she just caught the scent of something unpleasant. "Mr. Donovan," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Victoria Harrington, president of the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association. We've received reports of unauthorized structures on your property." I invited her in for coffee, hoping to make a good impression, but she declined, preferring to stand in my doorway like a sentinel. "Our bylaws clearly state that all exterior modifications must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee," she continued, flipping through papers on her clipboard. "Your bird cages weren't approved." "They're called mews," I corrected politely. "And I didn't realize they needed approval. They're not permanent structures." Section 7, paragraph 12 of our bylaws states that any structure, temporary or permanent, visible from any angle outside your property requires written approval. She handed me a yellow notice. "You have 7 days to remove them or submit proper documentation for review." As she turned to leave, I noticed something peculiar. She paused at the edge of my property, pulled out her phone, and appeared to be taking photos of my backyard. "Is there something else?" I called out. Victoria slipped her phone into her pocket with practiced precision. "Just documenting the violation, Mr. Donovan. Welcome to Pinecrest Estates." That evening, I met my neighbor, Frank Chen, while retrieving my mail. When I mentioned the encounter, his expression darkened. "Victoria runs this place like her personal kingdom," he warned. "Ever since she became president last year, it's gotten worse. She's added 17 new rules and doubled the fines. Be careful." I nodded, still clutching the yellow notice. "I will be." What I didn't know then was that the birds I'd spent years training would soon become my greatest allies in what would turn into the strangest neighborhood war Pinecrest Estates had ever seen. The following week, I submitted the proper documentation for my mews. I included detailed architectural drawings, materials list, and even letters from my previous HOA in Montana confirming the structures complied with regulations there. I figured this would resolve the issue. I was wrong. 10 days later, a certified letter arrived. My application had been denied. The reason? Structures do not maintain the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and may harbor dangerous wild animals. Dangerous wild animals. My birds were federally licensed, professionally trained raptors. I'd been a licensed falconer for decades, and my birds performed at conservation events and schools. They were practically celebrities in my old town. I called the HOA office immediately and scheduled a meeting with Victoria. When I arrived, she was seated behind an imposing mahogany desk in the community center office. The wall behind her was lined with framed certificates and community awards, most bearing her name. "Mr. Donovan," she said without looking up from her computer, "we've reviewed your application thoroughly." "With all due respect," I began, placing my federal falconry license on her desk. "These birds are not dangerous pets. They're licensed educational animals. I've been a master falconer for 15 years. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Pinecrest Estates is a residential community, not a wildlife sanctuary. We have children here. Pets are limited to dogs under 50 pounds, cats, and small cage animals like hamsters. These are not pets, I explained, trying to keep my frustration in check. They're working birds of prey with federal protection. Then perhaps Pinecrest isn't the right community for your hobby. She smiled thinly. You have 30 days to comply, or we'll be forced to begin fining you $100 per day. As I was leaving, I noticed Victoria whispering to Bradley Wells, the HOA vice president and owner of the largest real estate agency in town. They both glanced my way, then quickly turned back to their huddle. That weekend, I was in my backyard exercising Artemis on her creance line, essentially a long training leash for raptors, when I heard a peculiar buzzing overhead. Looking up, I spotted a drone hovering about 50 feet above my property. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of Victoria standing in the common area, controller in hand. I waved at her. The drone immediately retreated. The next day, I received another notice. This one cited unauthorized recreational activities that could endanger residents. Flying my birds on training lines in my own backyard was apparently now against the rules too. When I called the HOA office to question this, the secretary informed me that the board had held an emergency meeting and passed a new bylaw. No wild or exotic animals may be trained, exercised, or displayed anywhere within Pinecrest Estates. That's specifically targeting me, I protested. The board has the authority to create bylaws as needed for community safety, she replied mechanically. That evening, Frank came over with a bottle of whiskey and some concerning information. Victoria's son-in-law just listed a house for sale on this street, he said, pouring me a generous glass. Word is, they'd want to flip all the properties here for a major development. Your house sits on the largest lot in the neighborhood. So this isn't really about my birds, I said, the pieces starting to fit together. It never is, Frank replied grimly. It's always about money. The drone surveillance increased over the next 2 weeks. Almost daily, I'd spot one hovering over my property, sometimes for hours. I documented each instance with photographs and videos, including timestamps. I called the local police, but they claimed it wasn't technically trespassing, since the drone wasn't physically on my property. Then things got worse. I returned home from work one day to find my garbage cans overturned, trash strewn across my lawn. Another day, someone had placed rotting fish in my mailbox. Anonymous notes appeared on my windshield. Bird freight, go home and sell your house. The intimidation campaign was obvious, but Victoria was too smart to leave evidence linking her to these acts. When I installed security cameras, the harassment became more subtle. The HOA suddenly required lawn maintenance to meet exact specifications. I received notices for grass being 3.5 inches tall instead of the mandated 3 inches. My mailbox was apparently 2 inches too far from the curb. Each violation came with increasing fines. Within a month, I'd accumulated over $1,200 in penalties. My neighbors weren't faring much better. Frank received citations for his garden gnome collection. Mrs. Abernathy across the street, a widow in her 70s, was fined for hanging bird feeders. The Sullivans down the block got written up because their children's playground equipment was an unapproved shade of blue. One evening, Frank, Mrs. Abernathy, the Sullivans, and several other neighbors gathered in my living room. Victoria and her board are trying to drive down property values so her son-in-law's company can buy homes cheap, explained Frank, spreading out documents on my coffee table. I found these land development plans at the county recorder's office. They're planning luxury condominiums. But that's illegal, isn't it? Asked Mrs. Abernathy. It's unethical for sure, said James Sullivan, who happened to be an attorney. But proving it is another matter. They're hiding behind HOA bylaws. That night, the drone appeared again, this time hovering just outside my bedroom window. I could see its camera pointing directly at me. It was no longer just about getting me to move. This was harassment. The next morning, I woke to a new email from the HOA. Apparently, someone had reported strange noises coming from the bird structures. The HOA would be conducting an inspection of my backyard in 48 hours. When I showed the email to Frank, he shook his head. They're fabricating reasons to enter your property and find more violations. I called several attorneys that day, but most wanted retainers larger than my monthly salary. The ones who were affordable warned me that HOA law was complex, and I'd likely spend years and thousands of dollars fighting this battle. That evening, as I sat in my backyard watching the sunset, Hermes, my peregrine falcon, grew suddenly alert. His head tilted upward, his keen eyes tracking something in the sky. The familiar drone was back, hovering lower than usual. As I watched my falcon watching the drone, an idea began to form. These birds weren't just my companions. They were precision hunters with skills honed over millennia of evolution. I had been playing defense. Perhaps it was time to let my birds lead the attack. The morning of the scheduled inspection, Victoria arrived with Bradley Wells and another board member I didn't recognize. They stood at my front door with clipboards and measuring tapes, looking like a small invading army. "We'll need access to your backyard," Victoria stated without preamble. "Of course," I replied pleasantly. "I just need to secure my birds first. For your safety." As I led them through the house, Victoria's eyes darted everywhere, clearly looking for violations. When we reached the backyard, I noticed her disappointment at finding everything immaculate. The lawn was precisely mowed, the mews were clean and well maintained, and my birds were perched calmly on their weathering blocks. "These are your birds?" Bradley asked, keeping his distance. "Yes, this is Artemis and Apollo, Harris's hawks. And that's Hermes, a peregrine falcon. They're trained for falconry and conservation education." "They look dangerous," Victoria remarked, making a note on her clipboard. "They're trained to hunt small game, not people," I explained. "Though they do have an interesting hunting instinct for anything that flies like prey." Victoria ignored my comment. For the next hour, they measured everything in my yard with obsessive precision. They checked the height of my grass with a ruler. They measured the distance between my patio furniture. They documented the exact dimensions of the mews. Finally, Victoria turned to me with a triumphant smile. "Your mews are 6 inches taller than allowed for accessory structures. And the material doesn't match approved siding options. And your birds," Bradley added, "are clearly causing a disturbance. I can hear them screeching." "They're not screeching," I corrected. "They're simply alert because there are strangers in their territory." "We'll be issuing violations," Victoria stated flatly. "You have 14 days to remedy these issues or face daily fines." As they were leaving, I heard the now familiar buzz of a drone approaching. Victoria and Bradley exchanged knowing glances. "Interesting timing," I remarked. "Many residents use recreational drones," Victoria replied smoothly. "It's perfectly allowed under our bylaws." After they left, I watched as the drone hovered over my backyard, its camera clearly focused on my birds. Artemis tracked it with her piercing gaze, shifting on her perch. I could almost see her calculating the drone's flight pattern. That evening, I received an email with a staggering list of violations totaling over $3,000 in fines. The most serious: harboring dangerous animals that pose a threat to community safety. The email concluded with what amounted to an ultimatum. "The board recommends you consider whether Pinnacrest Estates is the right community for your lifestyle. Bradley Wells Realty would be happy to assist you in listing your property." Later that night, I heard a familiar buzzing outside my window. The drone was back, hovering just beyond my property line, its camera pointed directly into my living room. This wasn't just surveillance anymore, it was intimidation. I'd spent 20 years training birds of prey to hunt on command. Birds that could spot a mouse from hundreds of feet in the air. Birds that could dive at speeds over 200 miles per hour. Birds that were hardwired by evolution to hunt flying objects. Perhaps it was time to put that training to use. I picked up my phone and called Frank. "I need your help," I said. "And bring your camera." The first step in my counter-offensive required research. I spent the next week studying drone laws, property rights, and HOA regulations. James Sullivan, my neighbor with legal expertise, helped me navigate the complex web of statutes. "Here's the interesting part," he said, pointing to a passage in the state legal code. "While drones can legally fly over your property, if they're being used for surveillance, that could constitute invasion of privacy. And if they're harassing you or your animals, that's another violation." Meanwhile, Frank and I documented every drone appearance. We set up cameras at strategic points around my property and began collecting evidence of the coordinated harassment campaign. We captured footage of Victoria and Bradley operating the drone, systematic surveillance patterns, and even recorded conversations where they discussed using the drone to catch that bird guy violating something. But the most important preparation happened in my backyard. For years, I trained my birds using lures, artificial targets that simulate prey. Now, I created a new kind of lure, a small drone-shaped object attached to a training line. Day after day, I worked with Artemis and Apollo, teaching them to identify this new prey and strike it precisely. Harris's hawks are unique among raptors for their cooperative hunting style. In the wild, they work in family groups to take down prey larger than any individual could handle alone. Artemis and Apollo, siblings from the same clutch, already possessed this natural teamwork. I simply refined their skills for a very specific target. Hermes, my peregrine, required different training. As the fastest animal on Earth, capable of reaching speeds over 200 miles per hour in a dive, he was naturally equipped to intercept flying objects. I trained him to strike with precision, but not to grip, to hit and release rather than capture. While training my birds, I also engaged in community organizing. Frank and I went door to door, documenting neighbor complaints and building a coalition of homeowners fed up with Victoria's regime. We discovered that nearly 70% of residents had received questionable violations in the past year. We needed 2/3 majority to call for a special election and remove the board, Frank explained during one of our strategy sessions. But people are afraid of retaliation. There won't be once they see we can fight back, I promised. 2 weeks after the inspection, I received a certified letter indicating that due to my failure to address violations, the HOA was placing a line on my property. The letter also included a generous offer from Bradley Wells Realty to purchase my home for 30% below market value to help me move to a more suitable location. That evening, as expected, the drone appeared again, hovering over my backyard where I was exercising my birds. This time, however, I was ready. Frank was positioned across the street with a high-resolution camera. Mrs. Abernathy was in her garden, acting as an additional witness. The Sullivans were hosting a barbecue, ensuring plenty of neighbors would see what happened next. I released Artemis from her tether. She took to the sky, circling higher and higher until she was well above the drone. Spotting her, the drone operator, Victoria, according to Frank's zoom lens, began to move the drone erratically. But Artemis wasn't hunting alone. While Victoria was distracted by the first hawk, Apollo silently approached from the opposite direction. The hawks executed a perfect coordinated attack. Apollo drove the drone downward, while Artemis struck from above. Their talons grasped the drone's propellers, and with precise movements, they disabled 2 of them without damaging themselves. The crippled drone spiraled down, landing with a crash in the community garden, public property. Victoria came running, her face contorted with rage. "Your birds attacked my drone," she shrieked, pointing at me accusingly. "That's destruction of property." My birds were flying freely in the sky, as they're legally permitted to do, I replied calmly. If your drone got in their way, that's hardly my responsibility. I'm calling the police, she threatened. Please do, I responded. I'd like to file a harassment report anyway. I have weeks of documented evidence showing your drone invading my privacy. Victoria's face paled as she noticed neighbors gathering, many filming with their phones. This very public confrontation wasn't part of her plan. This isn't over, she hissed before retreating with her damaged drone. Later that evening, I posted carefully edited footage of the incident to the neighborhood online forum. The video clearly showed the drone hovering over my property for extended periods before my birds took flight. The post was titled, Hawks vs. Harassment, a Pinchas David and Goliath story. By morning, it had hundreds of comments from neighbors expressing support and sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. The tide was beginning to turn. The drone incident triggered a dramatic shift in neighborhood dynamics. My video went viral locally, even getting picked up by regional news outlets. The headline "Falconer's Birds Defend Home Against HOA Drone Surveillance" proved irresistible to viewers. When reporters contacted Victoria for comment, her defensive response, claiming the drone was simply monitoring for community safety, only made her look worse. In contrast, my calm explanation of raptor conservation and the harassment I'd endured painted me as the reasonable party. The HOA board hastily called an emergency meeting, clearly hoping to regain control of the narrative. They underestimated the community's frustration. The normally half-empty monthly meetings saw the community center packed to capacity, with residents spilling out into the parking lot. Victoria attempted to limit public comments to 3 minutes each, but the crowd shouted her down. For over 2 hours, homeowners took turns describing arbitrary fines, sudden rule changes, and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Abernathy, trembling but determined, described how she'd received violation notices for her bird feeders within days of declining an offer to sell her home to Bradley's company. The Sullivans shared documentation showing how their approved playground equipment was suddenly deemed non-compliant after James questioned financial discrepancies in the HOA budget. The pattern was unmistakable. Properties that Bradley's company wanted to acquire were being targeted with violations to drive down values and force sales. When it was my turn to speak, I presented our evidence methodically. Frank projected a map showing properties that had received the most violations, all strategically located for the planned condominium development. I shared footage of the drone surveillance, time-stamped and geotagged. Finally, I presented copies of emails between Victoria and Bradley discussing how to accelerate acquisition of the Burdiguy's property. "How did you get those emails?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill. "They were sent from HOA accounts," I explained. "Under state law, those are association records that any member has the right to request." Victoria's face flushed dark red. Bradley attempted to interject, claiming the emails were taken out of context, but the damage was done. Then came the coup de grace. James Sullivan stood and formally moved to hold a special election to recall the board. Frank immediately seconded the motion. When Victoria tried to rule it out of order, James cited the specific bylaw allowing for recall elections with a 2/3 petition from homeowners. "We have the signatures right here," he announced, producing a thick stack of papers. "Collected and notarized as required." Victoria's composure finally shattered. "This is absurd. We've maintained property values and community standards. Without us, this neighborhood would fall into chaos." "Actually," interjected a woman I hadn't met before, "I'm Caroline Weber from the State Attorney General's Office, Real Estate Fraud Division. We've been investigating complaints about this HOA for months. After tonight's testimonies and evidence, I believe we have enough to move forward with a formal investigation." A stunned silence fell over the room. Victoria looked as though she might faint. Bradley was already edging toward the exit. Caroline continued, addressing the crowd. If anyone has further documentation of harassment, selective enforcement, or conflicts of interest, my office will be conducting interviews tomorrow at the community center. The meeting adjourned in chaos, with Victoria and the board members hurrying out while avoiding reporters' questions. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors I barely knew approached to thank me, shake my hand, or simply share their relief that someone had finally stood up to the regime. Frank tapped me on the shoulder as we walked home. "The birds of prey found their prey after all," he said with a grin. "The battle's not over," I cautioned. "Victoria won't go down without a fight." I was right. That night, I received an email notification of an emergency board action. Effective immediately, any homeowner whose property was under violation notice was barred from using community facilities or voting in HOA matters. Victoria was attempting to disenfranchise her critics before the recall election. The war for Pinnacrist Estates was entering its final phase. The next 2 weeks were a frenzy of activity. The Attorney General's investigation created a protected environment where neighbors finally felt safe coming forward. Dozens of residents provided statements, documentation, and evidence of the board's misconduct. Meanwhile, Victoria launched a desperate counteroffensive. A glossy newsletter appeared in every mailbox warning that radical elements were trying to destabilize our community values. She held invitation-only gatherings for supporters, promising to protect their property values from exotic animal enthusiasts. Most disturbing was the sudden appearance of professional security guards patrolling the neighborhood. They claimed to be monitoring for bylaw violations, but seemed particularly focused on photographing homes belonging to recall supporters. James Sullivan challenged the legality of hiring security without a membership vote. Victoria cited an obscure emergency powers clause in the bylaws. When James requested financial records showing how these guards were being paid, he was told the documents were under review. Our coalition worked tirelessly. Frank coordinated a door-to-door information campaign. The Sullivans set up a legal aid station in their garage to help neighbors fight unfair violations. I hosted educational sessions about birds of prey in my backyard, combining conservation information with updates on our HOA battle. These raptor demonstrations became unexpectedly popular. Families brought children to see Artemis and Apollo perform training flights. Holmes, with his spectacular dives, became a neighborhood celebrity. The birds that Victoria had tried to use to ostracize me had instead brought the community together. 3 days before the recall election, disaster struck. I returned home from work to find animal control officers at my door. "We've received reports of unlicensed, dangerous exotic animals on the premises," the lead officer explained apologetically. "We have a court order to inspect and potentially remove them." I invited them in and showed them my federal and state falconry permits, the birds' health certificates, and my facility inspection records. The officers were professional but thorough in their inspection. "Everything seems in order," the lead officer finally concluded. "Your paperwork is complete, and the birds appear well cared for." "May I ask who filed the complaint?" I inquired. "Anonymous," he replied, though his expression suggested he knew more than he could say. "But I will note in my report that this appears to be a false report, which is itself a violation." After they left, I received a text from Frank. "Emergency board meeting called for tonight. Closed session." That evening, Frank and I joined dozens of neighbors gathered outside the community center. Though we couldn't enter the closed session, James Sullivan had planted a legal recording device inside. Perfectly legal under state open meeting laws. What we heard was shocking. Victoria proposed using nearly $100,000 from the reserve fund, money meant for community repairs and improvements, to file a SLAPP lawsuit against me and other recall leaders. SLAPP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation, are designed not to win but to drain opponents financially through legal costs. "We don't need to win," Victoria's voice came clearly through the speaker. "We just need to tie them up in court until they run out of money or give up." Bradley's voice chimed in. I've already spoken with the firm. They're prepared to file first thing tomorrow. I looked at James, alarmed. Can they do that? It's highly illegal to use HOA funds this way, he replied grimly. But by the time that's proven in court, the damage would be done. Just then, Caroline Weber from the Attorney General's office arrived with 2 police officers. The crowd parted to let them enter the community center. 10 minutes later, Victoria and Bradley emerged, escorted by the officers. They weren't in handcuffs, but their expressions were grim. Caroline addressed the gathered crowd. Based on evidence collected during our investigation and what we've just witnessed, we're issuing a cease and desist order freezing all HOA financial actions until our investigation is complete. We're also requesting an emergency court injunction to allow the recall election to proceed under neutral supervision. She held up a flash drive. This recording of tonight's closed session provides clear evidence of intended misappropriation of HOA funds and planned legal harassment of homeowners exercising their rights. As Victoria was led to a waiting car, she locked eyes with me. Her expression contained no remorse, only cold fury and the promise of retaliation. The day of the recall election arrived under strange circumstances. County officials supervised the voting process while state investigators continued to comb through HOA records. Victoria and Bradley were notably absent, having been advised by their attorneys to avoid public appearances. The results were overwhelming. 87% of homeowners voted to recall the entire board. A provisional board was elected, with Frank as interim president and James as legal counsel. Their first official action was to suspend all outstanding violation notices pending review. As provisional board members signed the official recall documents, a familiar buzzing sound caught my attention. Looking up, I spotted a drone, larger and more sophisticated than the previous one, hovering just beyond the community center. Word spread rapidly through the crowd. Neighbors pointed and shouted, some reaching for phones to record the intrusion. The drone didn't retreat. Instead, it moved closer, its camera clearly targeted on our gathering. I caught Frank's eye and nodded slightly. He grinned and continued signing documents, deliberately drawing the drone operator's attention. Meanwhile, I stepped outside and removed a small device from my pocket. A specialized whistle used in falconry. I blew 3 short bursts, a signal my birds were trained to recognize even at considerable distances. What happened next would become neighborhood legend. From 3 different directions, my raptors appeared. They had been weathering on specially designed perches on my roof, enjoying the sunshine while keeping watch, a normal part of their daily routine. But they were always ready for the hunt. Artemis and Apollo coordinated perfectly, approaching from opposite angles. Hermes, true to his namesake, became a blur of speed. The peregrine entered a stoop, a hunting dive, from nearly 500 feet above. He struck the drone with devastating precision, his impact sending it into a spin directly into the waiting talons of the Harris hawks. The 3 birds executed their attack with such coordination that onlookers gasped. The drone, its propellers shredded, crashed directly in front of the community center steps. And there, running from behind a neighboring building, camera controller in hand, was Victoria. The crowd fell silent as she froze, caught in the act despite the court order restricting her from interfering with HOA proceedings. The police officers present didn't need any explanation. As Victoria was escorted away, this time in handcuffs, my birds circled once overhead before returning to their perches at my home. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The predators had become protectors, and Pinecrest Estates was free. 6 months after the dramatic recall election, Pinecrest Estates had transformed. The newly elected HOA board, with Frank as president, implemented sweeping reforms. Arbitrary rules were eliminated. Violation protocols now required documentation and appeals processes. Financial records were posted monthly on the community website for complete transparency. Victoria and Bradley faced serious consequences. The Attorney General's investigation uncovered evidence of wire fraud, misappropriation of HOA funds, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Both accepted plea deals rather than face trial. Victoria received probation and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board. Bradley's real estate license was suspended pending a separate investigation. The most satisfying outcome was the dissolution of their development plans. Documents seized during the investigation revealed they had leveraged HOA authority to systematically harass homeowners whose properties were essential to their scheme. When the condominium developer learned of the investigation, they quickly withdrew their offer to purchase the properties. As for me, I became something of a local celebrity. My birds and I were invited to give educational demonstrations at schools, community events, and even the county fair. Children who had once been told to avoid the crazy bird man now begged their parents to visit for educational sessions. The new HOA rules included specific provisions for regulated keeping of falconry birds, forming a template that other communities eventually adopted. Artemis, Apollo, and Hermes gained their own following on social media, with their drone takedown video surpassing 1 million views. One sunny Saturday, exactly 1 year after the drone incident, we held a community celebration in the park. Families gathered for a potluck picnic, children played on new playground equipment, and neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now chatted like old friends. Frank approached me with a glass of lemonade. "You know what today is, right?" I nodded. "The anniversary of the revolution." "We're calling it Raptor Day officially," he said with a grin. The board voted unanimously. I laughed. "That seems excessive." "Not at all. Before you and your birds stood up to Victoria, we were all just taking the abuse individually. You showed us we could fight back." Mrs. Abernathy joined us, her garden hat festooned with buttons bearing silhouettes of birds of prey. "My grandchildren are visiting next weekend," she said excitedly. "They want to see the famous hawks." As if on cue, Artemis let out a call from her perch at the educational display I'd set up. Children gathered around as I explained how raptors help maintain healthy ecosystems. Later that afternoon, as the celebration continued, I noticed a familiar buzzing sound. For a moment, old tensions rushed back, until I realized it was James Sullivan's new photography drone, which he was using to take aerial group photos of the community. I watched it hover safely above us, documenting our celebration. My birds, perched nearby, tracked it with their keen eyes but remained calm. They had been trained to distinguish between friend and foe. In the evening, as I packed up my equipment, Frank helped me load the portable perches into my truck. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "there's a strange poetry to all this. Victoria thought your birds would drive everyone away, but they ended up bringing us all together." I nodded, watching as Hermes performed one last flight demonstration, soaring high above Pinnacrist Estates before returning precisely to my gloved hand. "That's the thing about predators," I replied. "In a healthy ecosystem, they don't just hunt. They create balance." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Is that a metaphor for our HOA?" "Maybe," I said with a smile. "Every community needs its guardians. Sometimes they have talons." As we drove home, my birds secured in their travel cases, I reflected on how differently things had turned out from what I'd expected when moving here. I'd found not just a house, but a true community, one willing to fight for what was right. And whenever a drone appeared in the skies above Pinnacrist Estates these days, people didn't look up in fear. They smiled, knowing that somewhere, a hawk was watching. The end.